My
Malik, how
brother,
you
how you
doing?
doing? Hey, good. How are you? I appreciate you getting up with me this morning, my man.
Hey, it's a lot later for me than for you, so
Oh, okay,
not a
that's true.
problem.
That's true. Well, I definitely wanted to go ahead and introduce you to my audience here on Black Power Media Reloaded. Brother G. Derek Musgrave is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's a journalist and author of Chocolate City, A History of Race, Democracy, in the Nation's Capital. And he's also author of Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics, How the Harassment of Black Elected Officials Shaped Post-Civil Rights America. And certainly he's had many other writings. But again, I want to thank you for appearing on the show this morning. And how you doing, my brother?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about this book, brother. It is a page turner, Chocolate City. And again, what inspired you to write it, and then explain the title?
Sure. So I was not the person who decided to write this book. I was working at the University of District of Columbia with my co-author Chris Myers Ash, and I told him this crazy story about how I ended up having to teach the DC history class. And so we had this policy where if your class didn't fill up, I was teaching a standard African American survey course, and we had this policy where if your class didn't fill up, they dropped the class right then and there on the first day, and you had to get another class from your chair. And so my African American history class had like two students too few. So my chair assigned me the only other class that was available, which was DC history. And I had no idea what I was doing. You know, I had never taught DC history before, and I sort of stumbled through the class. I literally was learning it as I'm teaching it to my students. It was a really bad situation,
Mhm.
and I told Chris about it because I thought it was a funny story. And I kind of ended the conversation by saying, you know, I really wish I had had a good updated text on DC history that I could have used as a base text for that class. And so the last, you know, sweeping history of the district that had come out was in like 1967 for that focused on African Americans. It was a little before that that focused on the city more generally. I say, you know, that needs to be updated. I wish somebody would do that. And you know, Chris kind of didn't say anything. I thought my story was funny. He didn't even laugh. I was annoyed. And about a month, about a week later, pardon me, he sent me a book proposal, like sort of a sketch outline of a book proposal. He said, you know, we should write that book. And I was just finishing up my previous book, Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics. And so once I got done, I immediately jumped into co-authoring Chocolate City with Chris, and that's how it ended up happening. But you know, Chris was the reason he decided to put the book proposal together is that Chris is a DC native. I'm not. I grew up in Baltimore,
Okay. All right.
and you know he's Chris is like hardcore DC. Like you know he was
Mhm.
in the Marion Barry Summer Youth Program. You know he had grown up here. He'd gone to all public schools here, and you know, he knew that there wasn't a lot of respect locally, even among DC residents for DC history. And so when I told him that story, it really you know, raised some issues that he had been dealing with since back in high school when his DC history teacher had tried to cut the DC history course short. And she literally said to the students, you know, DC doesn't really have that much history, so we're not going to spend too much time on it.
Okay.
Chris was furious. This is his home, right?
Right.
And so he put together a book proposal, and that was that. You know, we were off to the races. Now, once we wrote the book, we had to sit down and sort of figure out a title. You know,
Mhm.
when we put the book proposal together, we did. I think we gave it some standard title. I can't remember. Um, but as soon as we sat down to wrote the book, I said, Chris, we got to call this thing Chocolate City.
Okay.
You know, he must have paused for like 4 seconds and said, he said, "Cool, that's it. Let's
Okay.
go."
I like
Um,
that.
and my reasoning was that my father's a big Funkadelic fan.
Mhm.
And so, for those of you who know Funkadelic, you know that P Funk put together an album in 1975 called Chocolate City.
Yes,
And
that's right.
it was an ode to the District of Columbia, where it would do huge shows, and it would do, DC has Howard University. There's a couple of other colleges in the area where they had a big sort of fan base. So they do, 3, 4, 5 shows a year in the DC area. And they would do really good shows here.
Okay.
And they knew that the city was 75% African American in 1975, that people in the city were calling it Chocolate City. And they took that nickname and they basically said, like, let's do an ode to all the chocolate cities out there, but we'll focus on DC because it's one of the blackest. And it's also the most important because it's the nation's capital.
Right.
Now, what we meant when we said Chocolate City was not just DC during the years that it had a black majority, which is roughly 1957 to 2011.
Okay. All right.
Because the book spans 1608 to 2011, right? So we left a couple of years out if that's what we meant.
Right.
What we meant by Chocolate City was that DC has always had a large black population, no less than 20% for its entire history. And then that black population was very influential in how the city was governed, debates about democracy in the city, both at the local level and at the national level, where Congress was trying to figure out what to do with the city. And that population was nationally influential in Black America. DC has regularly held the title of capital of Black America over the course of the 200 years that Congress has been in town. And so we thought it worked out pretty well.
Okay. Well, tell me, for some reason, the way you wrote the book and in terms of people I know from the DMV, if you will, I thought for sure you were like DC. And tell me a little bit about your upbringing, your academic journey, and what led you to veer toward history.
Sure. So, I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. Both my mother and my father are from Connecticut. In fact, my grandparents are from Connecticut. And we moved down to Baltimore for my father to work in local government about 1980. And both my parents had been active in the Black Power or the Black Arts movement. My father had collaborated just a little bit with New Left and Black Power groups in New Haven, the ones kind of swirling around Yale University. And then my mother had written an ABC book for children in the late 1960s called Ashanti to Zulu. And her motivation for doing that was that she knew growing up that she had never had a children's book that had depicted Black children in a positive light. She grew up being handed books like Little Black Sambo, which was regularly circulated in American elementary schools in the 1960s. In places like Connecticut. This isn't even Mississippi, this is Connecticut, right? And so she wanted to create a replacement for those racist elementary school books. And so the first book she ever wrote while she was in grad school was Ashanti to Zulu. It was actually part of a contest for writing a Black children's book. And she was able to get the contract, and she had wonderful artists who really treated their subjects with dignity and respect. And so it won at Caldecott, and it's still in print to this day. And so their exertions as Black Power activists and Black arts movement activists on the margins of the movement, but nonetheless in it, really sort of fueled my desire to understand how my parents' generation had attempted to change the American democracy, how they had succeeded. And I really wanted to understand how they had succeeded and how they had failed. I mean, I'm a guy who grew up, I can remember in our first floor restroom. I'm not sure why it was in the restroom, but it was in the restroom.
Okay.
There were pictures of Malcolm X and Amiri Baraka on the wall. They were hand-drawn pictures. I don't know who drew them. Okay. But, these sort of patron saints of the Black arts and the Black Power movements, right? And they were my father's. My mother, was very happy to have them there as well. And I grew up with stuff like that around me. I grew up with, Bob Marley's Survival playing on the record player on the weekends, or, going down to a local church. It was sort of like the in-town, sort of new lefty type of church that was inviting Kwame Ture to town to speak on behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. When I was 10, my mother took me to a Free South Africa movement protest. And so having all that stuff around me, I got curious, who are these graying revolutionaries that my parents say are important people? What did they do at the height of their influence? What are they still doing now? And is it even working? And how do Black folks get free in this new moment that we're dealing with? Because, of course, I grew up in the middle of the crack era, in the Reagan era. And so most of my scholarly pursuits have been about trying to answer those questions, trying to understand my parents' generation, where they succeeded and where they failed.
Okay. And I thought it was very interesting about Marion Barry as well, his time period, because many people think of the latter Marion Barry in terms of some of the things he had to go through and some of the problems, but he was quite the activist and quite the leader, student leader. How important is that student leadership? When you look at a person like Marion Barry, and then you look, you try to inspire the young generation to, in a sense, follow in that particular tradition. How important is that?
Oh, well, Marion Barry is, I'll answer the question in a couple ways. The first thing I'll say is that understanding Marion Barry is positively central to understanding Washington, D.C. Understanding Marion Barry, I think, is positively central to understanding the triumphs and the tragedies of the Black Power generation. And the story of Marion Barry kind of goes like this. He comes out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He's one of the older members of the Nashville sit-in movement. And he very quickly, because he's a little bit older, pretty politically sophisticated, driven guy, becomes the first director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then as the 60s progress, he kind of hits the fundraising circuit. So he's up in New York, talking to fundraisers, trying to get money that he can send down south to, float the activists who are actually doing the on-the-ground voter registration across Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, things like that. And he's a couple credits shy of finishing his PhD in chemistry. So, we almost lost him to the academy, but
okay.
But he decides in the mid 1960s not to go back to school, that he's actually going to go back into field work from the fundraising circuit. And he moves to Washington, D.C. in 1965. And the people that send him here hope that he's going to turn D.C. into a big fundraising hub for SNCC, and they're going to keep sending money into the Southern movement. And Barry says, no, I'm going to build my own kingdom here. I'm actually going to create a very active street level SNCC chapter here in Washington, D.C. And he begins to build it up. He does all these protests against bus fares that he thinks are too high on the buses. He starts a group called Free DC, which is all about gaining home rule for the District of Columbia. Many of your listeners may not know, particularly if they live in California, that Washington, D.C. had no local government whatsoever from the mid 1870s until 1974. Wow. The city was governed by 3 presidentially appointed commissioners. You couldn't vote for mayor, you couldn't vote for city council, you couldn't vote for dog catcher, because none of those things existed as elected positions in the district. And this was purposeful. During the Reconstruction experiment, right after the Civil War, Black folks were voting, and they were actually the definitive swing vote in local mayoral elections. And so local white supremacists basically said, well, if we can't get them to stop voting, we'll just get everybody to stop voting. And we forget sometimes, I think, that a lot of people in the mid 1800s are just a couple decades removed from a time when it was reasonably respectable to say that people didn't think that working class folks should be able to vote. Right. That those people who didn't necessarily pay a lot of taxes, didn't own property, didn't really have a say, shouldn't really have a say in how a government is run, because all they're going to do is use democracy to rob from the rich. And so what they would do is vote for higher taxes on the rich as sort of a progressive tax. And so a lot of rich people would just say openly, I don't think that working class people should vote. And so when there's this move to get rid of Black people, it's also a move to get rid of working class white people from the electorate. And it had pretty widespread support. And so for 100 years, DC has no local government. So Barry is part of that effort to bring local government back to the District of Columbia, knowing in 1965-66, when he founds Free DC, that local government will be supermajority Black. Because the DC population in 1966 is over 60% Black and is very rapidly growing as white people are leaving the city at the rate of tens of thousands per year during this period. And he basically parlays this street activism. He's a street activist for years, well into the early 1970s. And he's doing pretty much everything. He's organizing security patrols in the U Street area, sort of center of the poorest Black community in the district. During the uprising following Martin Luther King's assassination, he's working with local businesses to try and get federal grants because they had been starved of federal dollars for much of the segregation period. He's actually working through a group called Pride Incorporated to stand up Black businesses. And so, they owned a gas station, they owned a lawn care business, they owned a housing improvement business. And he parlays all that into elected office. He gets elected to the school board, then the council, and then eventually the mayorship. And he becomes the first former Black Power activist in the history of the United States of America to be elected mayor of a major American city. And so you can argue that by the time he's elected mayor in 1978, the movement has quite literally taken over an entire city. Because if you look at the city council at the same time, a supermajority of the council is either Black Power activists, civil rights activists, or anti-poverty activists. And so DC is in the hands of the movement by the late 1970s. And they try to remake the city into a place where Black folks can actually get a fair shake. I mean, it's remarkable considering how little power they have, what they're able to do. Very aggressive affirmative action program. When Barry's elected, 7% of the city's business is done with Black folks. When he's elected, the city is 75% Black. And 7% of the business is done with Black folks. By the mid-1980s, he jacks that up to 35%. Right? Bare knuckle stuff. I mean, he sits down in meetings with banks or with contractors, and he just looks around. Where's the Black folk? And then we'll get up and walk out. Come back when you got Black folk. Everybody got the message, right? Using. He also, he straightens out the city's finances. There's a move right now in Congress to take over the District of Columbia to get rid of what we call our home rule government, the government that Barry had helped to build. Republicans in Congress are essentially saying, well, these Black Democrats, and really Democrats generally, they don't know how to run cities. They're overrun with crime and all, bad legislation. So we're just going to take over the city. And in DC, they can actually do that. Congress can literally just pass a law to end democracy in the District of Columbia. And they've threatened to do it. There's Republicans in Congress now who have active bills that are, on the docket of the Senate and the House of Representatives to get rid of the government of the District of Columbia. And their argument has always been Congress is better capable of running a city than the local government. But that's BS. It's absolute BS. So when Barry walks into office in 1978, what he finds is that Congress had never done an audit of the city government. Now, keep in mind, there was always a city government. You always had, guys who picked up the trash and meter maids and police and all that stuff. You had to run the city. But Congress had just never done an audit. And so Barry's like, hey, how many people do we have on a payroll? Nobody could tell him. Nobody. Congress had run the city that poorly that it didn't know how many people worked for it. When he went to go look at the pension investment portfolio for the city, because, the city had all these people who had moved here, worked, and then moved somewhere else. because there's a lot of white city workers who had basically worked here as teachers or police. And as the city got blacker, they left.
Right.
And so the city's got to send all these checks all over the country for these pensioners. And so Barry said, well, how's our pension account doing that we're paying these people out of? And people were like, we don't have no pension account. Congress just used to pay them out the Treasury. I mean, this fundamentally, this is poor governance, right? Yeah. And Barry quite literally working with this big team of people. And I should point out, one of the reasons that Barry was so successful and he's so consequential as a figure is that dozens of other Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists moved to DC after 1965. I mean, I counted well over 3 dozen in like a little census I did a couple of years ago. And a lot of them are still here.
Okay. All right.
And so when he hired for all of his major advisors and agency heads, he hired all these movement people. I mean, brilliant, battle-tested activists who were Pan-African socialists, who were Black nationalists, who were at the very least Black power advocates, right? And they came in and imbued the government with all of those, that institutional knowledge and also those commitments, those ideological commitments. And they were able to sort of not just build a functioning government, right? Make sure that we actually had a pension account that we could pay people out of, make sure that we knew how many people we actually were working for the city, but then put together these programs which transferred huge amounts of rights and resources to poor Black people, people who had never been served by this government in any substantive and serious way. And so, we think of the 70s and 80s as this kind of slide towards the city's dysfunction. But if you look at the high schools that were opening up in the 1970s, Woodson Senior High School, or the remodeling of Dunbar High School.
Yeah, I remember Dunbar.
And Amber Wiley, who's a great architectural historian, has just written a book about this that's going to be out soon. I recommend it to everyone. But you can look at pictures from those schools and like these students are excited because they have brand new high schools with all of the great programs. H.D. Woodson actually had a scuba diving program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Where they would do scuba diving in the pool, during the week, and then they would head to the Caribbean every year for a major scuba diving trip. Like, this is what the city is creating for these Black kids that have been neglected by this city for so long, right? So Barry and his cohort, and that's critical to remember, right? These are folks who had sat at the feet of CLR James. These are folks who would come here with Stokely Carmichael, and now they're running the city government, right? These folks had really turned the place around, and so Barry was an absolutely transformative figure in the city's history. Now, I just went to a local charter school to go speak about Chocolate City a week ago.
Okay.
And I asked the students who were there. Now, granted, a lot of them were new immigrants from Central America, but a lot of them were Black kids from the city. Okay. And I said, what do y'all know about Marion Barry? And they said, smoked crack. 1990, got caught, right? And that is a failure, I think, of my generation to teach the broader story of Marion Barry, because what they've gotten about him is memes and sort of grainy pictures on FBI video. But that's sort of Barry at his worst. When he was at his best, and I'll just give you one quip, because I know I've taken a long time to answer your question.
Okay.
A woman named Carol Schwartz, great city councilwoman, Republican, but like, a moderate Republican here in DC is very different than Republicans across the country. And she ran against Marion Barry for the mayorship mid-1980s, and she wanted to beat him. She thought he was spending too much money and the city was going to go bankrupt, and it did. Not because he was irresponsible, but because of a bunch of other factors. And then you add on to that he was starting to spiral with his drug habit. But she said, look, folks will get down on Marion Barry a lot, but they have to admit that he was a better politician high than most of his peers were dead sober. Wow. Okay. This is someone who tried to put him out of office, right? It's just a fact. He was the best retail politician in the city's history, period.
Wow. And I have to say also, again, Marion Barry, he had such a diverse type of history, and it ties in really to Black DC because I was introduced to DC culture, if you will, through music. Chuck Brown. I used to go to the New Orleans Jazz Festival to go see Chuck Brown, and I remember watching EU and DC always had this great cultural influence. And how does that social and cultural influence of Black people in DC pretty much was illuminated in this book?
Yeah, so one of the things that Chris and I always like to say when we talk about the book is that
Mhm.
you know a Black majority in and of itself doesn't make a chocolate city.
Right.
Ferguson, Missouri was blacker than DC was in the 1970s when Mike Brown was killed. It was 83% Black. It was a horrible place to live as a Black person.
Right.
It was widespread poverty, not a lot to do. A disorganized Black community that struggled to sort of exercise political power. And DC was fundamentally different than that, which made it a chocolate city.
Right.
And chocolate city, we use a definition by a brother named Kenneth Carroll, a wonderful poet, who wrote up an op-ed in the Washington Post, which contained the definition. He said, look, chocolate city really had three things. First was the Black majority. You got to have Black people. And you're talking about 500,000 Black people, right, within 68 square miles. I mean, it's a huge Black population.
Right.
And the second thing was that you had the return of political power. And so DC basically becomes a democratic city with a council and a mayor and a school board at the same time that it becomes a majority Black city.
Mm.
And that Black government was guaranteed to run the city on behalf of the least of these, because it had that movement ethos that a lot of those people brought with it. But then the third thing was that it was absolutely bursting with Black culture, right? Just to give you a couple of ideas about this, right? So some of the Black Power organizations that were part of that effort of bringing Black power, Black democracy back to the city in the 1960s were also cultural organizations. So you had a group called the New School of Afro-American Thought, which was right on 14th and U Street, for those people who know DC, sort of in the heart of the Black community. Okay. And, their thing was, if we can save Black people's minds, we can ready their hands for revolution.
Oh, right on. Okay.
And so they would just shut down 14th Street, major artery in the middle of DC, shut down 14th Street and do concerts by Sun Ra. They were always doing poetry readings. Miri Baraka would come down from Newark, right? The first place that John Carlos went after the 1968 Olympics, when he raised the Black Power fist with Tommy Smith on the medal stand, was he did a press conference at the New School of Afro-American Thought, right? So these cultural institutions that are sort of creating spaces for Black folks to figure out who they are, what their aesthetic is, and how they can use those two things to reshape the society in their own interests. Black Panther Party, which I know so well, had its Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention here in the district. It starts off with a concert right in the middle of Malcolm X Park, right? You could go on and on and on, right? And that's in the sort of more radical organizations. Roberta Flack, y'all. Roberta Flack,
one of my favorites,
was a DCPS music teacher.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
Worked in the public schools. I mean, you can walk the streets of DC today, and you will find people not a little bit older than me say, "Yeah, Roberta Flack was my teacher. Like, she taught me how to sing. She taught me how to play the piano. She cut her whole first album at a gay bar right over on Pennsylvania Avenue near Eastern Market." Right. If you look at the picture of the first album, you can see the restaurant in the background. It's called Mr. Henry's. Right. We had several Black repertory theater companies, an African dance troupe. I mean, you could go on and on and on. Like, DC is bursting with culture. And so you get this soundtrack for revolution, this soundtrack for cultural rebirth. in the district. And that doesn't even include all the artists like Sam Gilliam, who are, creating beautiful images of Black life around the city. And so, it was a really exciting time to be in the district. And that also brought people in from other parts of the country who wanted to get a taste of this. And I'll just give you one last example that I think will also speak to you, knowing your own commitments, Malik. And that is that starting in 1972, activists in the city, mostly Pan-Africanists, created African Liberation Day here. And African Liberation Day was not just a national, but it was a worldwide protest against white settler colonialism in Southern Africa.
Right.
And the main march for African Liberation Day was in Malcolm X Park, and they'd march down through Embassy Row to the National Mall. The huge event, a lot of important speakers. And what a couple of local activists, mostly people associated with the DC Black Panther Party, realized was that some of the poorest neighborhoods in the district, in an area we call east of the river. So DC is bisected by two rivers, the Potomac and the Anacostia. And by the 1970s and 80s, the east side of the Anacostia is the poorest and blackest part of the city. And these Panther activists essentially said, look, ain't nobody from the east of the river going all the way over to Northwest, which is, kind of in the middle of the city, to go to African Liberation Day. So we're going to have sort of like a companion event here east of the river called Malcolm X Day.
Okay. All right.
And they do Malcolm X Day in 1972. It's a small affair, but they get people out, and they start to mobilize people east of the river for sort of this companion event and think about Southern African liberation. But over time, Malcolm X Day, which runs for the next 20 years, right? 20 plus years, pardon me.
Right.
They start to get huge crowds to the point where they have to move it to Anacostia Park, and they're getting, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people out to this thing. It's nuts, right?
Yeah.
And one of the Panther leaders, a guy named Charles Stevenson, is both a radical activist and a go-go promoter.
Oh, wow.
And so if you look at pictures of Malcolm X Day from the 1980s, the 1990s, you'll see Betty Shabazz, Stokely Carmichael, and EU, Experience Unlimited, the go-go band, or Backyard or something, right? So it's like, so there's this wonderful melding of politics and culture, right? That is absolutely sort of characteristic of the Chocolate City years, of activism in the Chocolate City years. And that was the deal. I mean, these were huge outdoor parties every May. And they were all about Pan-African liberation and about good Black music and having a good time.
Oh, wow. Well, I was a big, just in line with that same thought, I was a big eyes on the prize person. I loved when I looked at Howard University, Umgawa, Black Power, how that power was resonating and then going out into the Black community. Is that the thing that really separates DC from, say, the Black culture in Los Angeles, New York? It's that mumbo sauce, I guess, that makes it kind of different in terms of the climate, right?
I mean, I don't know, right? Like, you look at like the Southern California Panthers, right? It's like Bunchy Carter and that whole crew. I mean, they started out as doing performance poetry.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Which when I dug into the Southern California Panthers, I was like, really, Bunchy Carter was doing poetry? But that was sort of how a lot of people came to Black Power, and then they realized the limits of of culture as a weapon. It's really important for waking people up, but then you actually have to engage in activism to change your material circumstances. And so folks were melding the two out of necessity. It's like, how do we get people here to hear the revolutionary message? Well, we'll have a band, we'll do a poetry reading, and that generation, which comes to that understanding of how to mobilize, carries that through into the 80s and 90s. I'll do a little self-promotion here. I have a website called blackpowerindc.umbc.edu. If you just Google Black Power in DC, it'll come up. but
Okay.
it's a map of all the Black Power activism that took place in the city from 1961 until 1998. And that's
Wow.
because I see Black Power as it unfolded in DC as this sort of generational struggle, right? Where a group of young people kind of come on the scene and shake up politics in the districts, come to set the standard. And many of them kind of believe that they're done by the late 1970s. They're going to kind of retire into, good government jobs or something like that. And then Reagan comes to power and we have this massive recession and they feel like they got to dust off their old berets and leather jackets and head back out there, right? And they have this sort of resurgence of activism in the 80s and 90s. And so, you can see how they're doing some of the same things that they did in the 60s. They're doing them in the 80s and 90s, trying to get the movement sort of restarted. And so yeah, I mean, I think that you see people doing this all around the country. What's distinct about DC though is just the tremendous volume of Black folks.
Yeah.
Black folks are well over 60% of the population from the 60s through the 90s.
Wow.
Right. And and how well organized that Black community is, and organized around straight up activists. Like when Black folks take over LA, it's through a former cop who's pretty conservative.
Yeah. Tom Bradley.
Tom Bradley. But when Black folks take over DC, it's through a former Black Power activist,
right?
Who gets a visit from Stokely Carmichael in the mayor's office in 1979. Right? I mean, there's a picture of Stokely dressed all in white with an All African People's Revolutionary Party button on his shirt, sitting there meeting with Marion Barry in a three-piece suit. Right?
Wow.
So it's a fundamentally different type of Black politics that is able to take over the city in 1979 than what you got in DC, where you got a former cop, who is at loggerheads with someone like Police Chief Daryl Gates, but doesn't get rid of him.
Right.
He gives him a couple, he's not capable of getting rid of him, right? He doesn't have the numbers. I think LA was like 20% Black at the time.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so it's just it's a different way of existing in a city. Even though in absolute numbers, I mean, LA's Black population didn't look too different than DC's. We were in control, y'all weren't.
Right.
And that's no shade, because I know.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about the transition in terms of Black Power from the 60s to the 90s. You wrote one of the most well-researched and detailed articles called "There Is No Black Panther Party." There is no new Black Panther Party, which I thought was excellent. It was a very good teaching tool for me and from a research perspective. And talk about that article, what inspired it, and also what do you think people came away after reading it?
I'll actually leave that last one on the table because I have no idea.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, for your listeners, if you want access to the article, it was published in the Journal of the Association of African American Life and History, called the Journal of African American History. If you just go to the Journal of African American History website, you can download it. And I'm very proud to say it's one of the most read articles in the journal's recent history, one of the top 10. And that's in a journal that publishes some of my heroes and friends and colleagues, and I'm very proud to be in their number because of that article. I came to the article because I went to the University of the District of Columbia in 2002 for the Black Panther Party Film Festival. And so some of your listeners will know that the Black Panther Party had these reunions starting in the 1980s, I think it was, and accelerating into the 90s and 2000s, where the old Panthers members of the party would get together and they would discuss new research on the party. They would discuss films about the party, and they'd essentially try to burnish the party's legacy. And in 2002, they had I guess it was their 35th anniversary. They had postponed it after September 11th and had it a year later. And it happened to be at the University of the District of Columbia. So I went because I was living in the city at the time. I was working on Capitol Hill.
Okay.
And I went to this panel called "There Is No New Black Panther Party," and it was hosted by a brother who had run the Detroit branch back in the '60s. And it was these old heads from the Panthers. They started getting into it. They're like, these jokers out here that took our name, and we want everybody to know that they're not affiliated with us. And then the door in the back of the room busts open, and in walks Malik Zulu Shabazz, who was at the time the chair of the New Black Panther Party, which is this younger group that the old Panthers were talking about. He walked in with about 30 dudes, all dressed in black fatigues, jack boots. Some of them were wearing motorcycle helmets with the little shield down over their face. A lot of dudes have bandanas over their face. And this is before COVID, so we're used to people with masks now, but at the time it was like, oh
it's
dear,
going down.
This is going to be a problem, right? I was about to curse. I didn't want to. This might be a family podcast, right?
Hey, say what you feel, brother.
Yeah, like real thugged out, gang type mess, right? And Malik walked to the front, and these cats surrounded the back of the room. It's in like a lecture hall, a college lecture hall. These cats basically surround the back of the room, and Malik walks up to the front, and he's like, "I'm sorry, what'd you say?" I mean, real street. I'm sorry. You said we don't exist. Clearly, we do exist. Is there a problem? I mean, just punk these old dudes, right? And of course he did. He's a bunch of 20-something-year-old guys, big, and they were ready to throw hands, and these 67-year-old Panthers ain't throwing hands with no 20-year-olds. That's absurd, right? And he basically got them to back down. He basically said, "You think I stole your history? I did. What are you going to do about it?" And they essentially said, "Well, I hope there's no misunderstanding, but we wish that y'all would be more aligned with the program that we had." And Malik's like, "Shut up," right? I mean, that's how it went down, right?
Yeah, right.
I saw this as a young historian. I was like, damn, I just witnessed the full-on theft of history, right in front of my face.
Wow.
And so I kind of took the old Panthers line. I was like, there's no new Black Panther Party. These are some jokers who stole the old Panthers history. And so I was like, I got to write about this. And it kind of set me on this long journey of sort of digging into who the new Panthers were. And along the way, I, of course, discovered the Panther Vanguard movement out in LA. Kwaku Duran, I believe, was at this event.
I was at it. I was at that as well.
Okay.
I was there as well. Yes.
And so, and I realized it was a much more complicated story than that. There's a much more complicated story than that. And when I figured out how complicated the story was, I realized that it would help me to get at this new question I'm dealing with in a book I'm writing right now, which is, it appears that there's this large group of people who try to bring the movement back in the 1980s and 1990s. And I wanted to understand why they did it. I wanted to understand how they did it. And I wanted to understand what they brought back and what they left behind, right? And the story of the New Black Panther Party allowed me to do that, right? So what I found out was that there's actually this effort among a group of young people basically my age, right? I'm in my late 40s.
Okay.
And veteran Panthers. And what they see going on around them in the late 1980s and early 1990s is that Black communities are in absolute crisis. You've got Black unemployment that in most American cities is in the teens. For many young Black people is somewhere between 30 and 50%. You've got a crack epidemic, which led to a violence epidemic, which led to a massive police crackdown in the rise of mass incarceration. And you've essentially got circumstances in Black communities in the late 80s, early 90s that look like the circumstances in Boys in the Hood or Menace to Society. A lot of our our Black directors and producers at the time were really doing a good job of sort of showing the devastation of Reagan's America on inner city Black communities.
Right.
And these old heads are like, we got to do something about this. And they happen to get prodding from a lot of young heads, people my age, who were like, we need y'all to sort of help us figure out what to do about this.
Right.
And what a lot of them came up with, in many cases, independent of one another, in different cities around the country, is that we got to bring back the Black Panther Party.
Right.
And, Farrakhan is trying to bring back the Nation of Islam. Jesse Jackson is trying to bring back, Martin Luther King's crusade to save the soul of America. So it's not like they're the only ones that think about it, but they're like, well, we don't want to do the Jesse Jackson thing. We don't want to do the Farrakhan thing. We want to be Panthers, right? We want to bring back the revolutionary politics of the Panthers. And so they start founding all these Panther groups across the country. There's the there's a new African-American Vanguard movement, which later becomes the
New Panther Vanguard
movement. Proper name here, man.
Right, New Panther Vanguard movement.
New Panther Vanguard movement in Los Angeles.
Right.
There's a new Black Panther Party that started in Dallas.
Right.
There is the Black Panther Militia in Milwaukee, and then there's also a branch created in Indianapolis. On and on. There's about 11 different Panther groups, not just created in the United States, but there's also groups created in London and in Spain. I mean, like, folks are trying to bring back the Panther, not just across the country, but around the world. And the groups are relatively small. People are excited about the groups, but they don't really catch on, I think, the way a lot of people had hoped that they would. But that's very different than a bunch of young people sort of stealing the Panther idea from some old folks. It's actually an intergenerational effort to bring back the Black Panther Party.
Okay. Right on.
And it just so happens that in Dallas, the group that was called the New Black Panther Party is taken over by Khalid Muhammad, who was the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam under Farrakhan. And he is kicked out of the nation after he gives this wildly anti-Semitic and just mean speech at Keene College called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews.
Right.
And he's sort of looking around for a new home, a new organizational home. He ends up hooking up with the organizers of the New Black Panther Party, who provide security for him while he's in Dallas. And he says, like, hey, I could take this group over and it could be my new base of operations, because Farrakhan's not letting me back in the nation. Like, that ship has sailed. He comes to realize. So he takes it over and he imbues it with not just the politics of the Nation of Islam, but the most kind of rugged and sort of mean politics of the Nation of Islam. Khalid Muhammad was really, he was the guy that ran point in the nation's contact with a lot of rappers. He was the guy that ran point with the nation's contact with a lot of gangs. He spoke like he was from the streets, and he had a lot of respect in the streets.
Yeah, absolutely.
But his politics could be pretty ugly, right? If you look at them closely. And he takes over the New Black Panther Party, basically pushes out the founder,
Aaron Michaels, and
Aaron Michaels, who's kind enough to give me an interview, and all these disaffected members of the Nation of Islam flood into the New Black Panther Party because they want Farrakhan, who is kind of mellowing because he wants to do the Million Man March, and he wants to have a broader appeal, not just be thought of as a Black supremacist and an anti-Semite. And so they're like, Farrakhan, these young people are like, I feel like Farrakhan's kind of lost a step. I want to go with Khalid. They join the New Black Panther Party and make it, very sort of hard-edged, sort of vaguely Black supremacist, certainly anti-Semitic, and it transforms the organization. And they get on the news everywhere. And all these Panther-like groups are sort of stuck because they're like, people think that we follow Khalid. We don't. We're trying to bring back the Black Panther Party from the 60s.
Right.
And so they and the Panthers then mobilized to distance themselves from the new Black Panther Party. And that's when that fight happens that I saw in 2002 in Washington, D.C. And I'll just say this, that battle for who owns the Panther, who can represent themselves to the rest of the nation as a true manifestation of the Black Panther Party actually gets quite physical. So, Dhoruba bin Wahad, who's a famous member of the New York Panthers, and really operated nationally, who went to jail.
Kalonji Jamachanga as well. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So he worked with Kalani down in Atlanta, and he heard that Malik, Zulu, Shabazz, and the New Black Panthers were coming to Atlanta to do an event, and he's like, "I'm gonna confront them," because Dhoruba had aged, but he still had the mentality of a young, exceedingly tough dude who not only took on sort of other very tough Black folks in the streets, but he took on the cops. I mean, Dhoruba went to jail for years for killing a cop, like an NYPD officer. And so he went down there to confront Malik, and he's like, you need to stop misrepresenting yourself as a Panther. And Malik basically said, "Don't come near me, or I'm gonna I'm having my folks take care of you." And Dhoruba doesn't play that, so he stepped to him, and Malik's bodyguards beat the snot out of him. I mean, put him in the hospital for a long time. And I end with that to show that these really are two different manifestations of Panther activism. One is deeply influenced by Nation of Islam, and the other is actually rooted in the Panthers themselves, and they finally came to a head in the early 2000s. But no, folks have received the article well, but that's how I came into contact with you. That's how I came into contact with people like Aaron Michaels, founder of the New Black Panther Party, Kwaku Duran, and it was a wonderful experience for trying to understand the very complicated road that Black activism has trod in the 50 years after 1965 or so.
Right on. Well, again, I want to thank you for the referencing of my book, because I was someone kind of in the middle of all that. I wasn't exactly a Cub, but I was considered the second generation Panther, hence the name of my book. And again, I want to thank you for definitely looking into my book as a research tool as well.
Oh, it was indispensable, man. I mean, one of the reasons that I think I had a wide open lane to write this article. There's only been one other article on the New Black Panther Party, and it's sort of disputes with the older Panthers in academic journals. There had actually been a pretty good amount of stuff in by journalists.
Okay.
But it was like those it was those sort of indie newspapers, those small investigative journalism newspapers. Like here in DC, it's called the Washington City Paper. In New York, it's the Village Voice. Those papers that do really good local research, but they tend not to make it into New York Times, Washington Post.
Right.
And academics just hadn't figured it out. They'd either taken the Panthers at their word, the older Panthers, or they hadn't talked about it. And your book is the only one out there that tries to sort of give us this longer history and to show how groups with very different ideologies, could actually be organizing under the same symbol. And so it was absolutely indispensable. And it also, led me to a couple of archives I didn't know about. So I was actually out at USC not too long ago, going through Kwaku Duran's papers, because I had only been able to interview him for the article. And it's a treasure trove, man. And I think, hopefully, your work, my work will get a larger number of historians and social scientists to take post-civil rights era Black politics more seriously and dig a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. Again, let's put a pin on this, because I definitely don't want to hold you all day, but I just want to see what your future plans are and give a brief summary of your the rumor, repression, and racial politics, how harassment of Black elected officials shape post-civil rights America? Just kind of like a brief summary of that and future plans.
Sure. So you basically got me talking about my first book and then hopefully my next book, right?
Okay, yeah.
So Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics was my dissertation, and it became my first book. And the idea there was to look at something that I had encountered as a young person, which is all these Black elected officials around the country in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, claiming that the federal government was out to get them and was setting them up. Right. And you guys have probably heard this a lot lately. I mean, President-elect Trump is essentially saying that, the Biden administration was using the Justice Department to get me. The DA in New York was out to get me. They call it lawfare. And that's all BS. Right. But I heard Black elected officials saying that, going all the way back to Adam Clayton Powell and Julian Bond in the 1960s, and William Lacey Clay in the 1970s out of St. Louis. Mervyn Dimely, the former lieutenant governor of California in the 1970s, all the way down. And probably the most important part of it was I actually heard my next door neighbor, Clarence Mitchell Jr., who was a state senator, saying the Reagan administration had put him in jail for a couple of years. And I remember when he went to jail, I was probably about 12 years old or so.
Okay.
Wow. And so I tried to figure out what if this had any legs. Was this just a bunch of people who were guilty, claiming that the prosecution had set them up? Because that's that happens a lot, right? Like, were these guys just lying, trying to get out of jail? And what I found was that is absolutely not the case. There was actually a pattern. The reasons for it are different in different points in time, but there was a pattern of disproportionate investigation and prosecution of Black elected officials. Right. And I won't spoil the ending. I'd love for y'all to pick it up. But,
okay.
But the basic idea is that from the 60s through the 90s, and again, for different reasons, you do see a pattern, a significant pattern of disproportionate investigation and prosecution of Black elected officials. At one point, it's 5 to 1. And that's from Gwen Ifill back when she was working for NPR, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
She did an investigation of Justice Department prosecutions of federal officials, and she found that the disproportionality was tremendous. For every one white elected official being investigated and prosecuted by the DOJ, you get like 5 Black elected officials. And keep in mind that Black elected officials are a tiny percentage of U.S. elected officials, even today. I mean, you're talking about single-digit percentage of all elected officials in this country are Black, even though we're, somewhere in the area of 10 to 15% of the population across the period that I'm talking about. Okay. And so that's the first book. Okay. The second, the last book that I'm working on right now is called The Movement, We Must Take to the Streets Again, the Movement Resurgence in Conservative America. Okay. And it's really a thesis that I tested out with the new Black Panther Party article. Okay. And, instead of looking at a single group in that article, I'm looking at the sort of larger national picture. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that, a lot of Black folks think by the mid-1970s, like, hey, we're kind of on the path to equality. We're on the path to integration. And if you just take a snapshot of Black folks in the mid-1970s, mm-hmm. it doesn't look bad. Right. Affirmative action is putting a huge number of Black folks in jobs. A lot of schools are as integrated as they'll ever be in American history in the mid-1970s. They start to resegregate pretty radically after that. Okay. Tons of Black people are going to college. Mm-hmm. And then this tremendous economic restructuring hits that puts huge numbers of Black folks out of jobs. I mean, the Black unemployment rate by 1982 is 20% as the average, wow. Right? In places like LA, Black unemployment is 40-50% for young Black people, right? By the early 1980s. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the country is turning to the right. Instead of President Carter, who understood that Black people had put him in office in 1976, You have Ronald Reagan, who built his entire campaign against Black people.
Yeah.
And he and his vice president are president for the next 12 years.
Yeah. Wow.
And so what a lot of activists from the 60s and 70s do is they head back out into the streets. And you can to defend what they've already won and to expand on those gains. And you can see this across the country, whether it's the Jesse Jackson campaigns in 1984 and 1988, all the efforts to put Black folks in the mayor's office around the country. In the 1980s really are, sort of one of the high tides of Black folks gaining mayorships around the country.
Right.
To the Free South Africa movement in the mid 1980s, which overrides a presidential veto on a foreign policy matter. That had never happened before in the 20th century, right? Where Free South Africa protesters pushed Congress to divest from South Africa. Reagan vetoes the bill and they pass it over his veto. I mean, it's shocking stuff, right? To the rise of the Nation of Islam in the 1980s and 1990s, which eventually gives us the Million Man March. And so what I talk about in this next book is that period roughly from about 1982 to 1997, where you see this new effort to restart the movement and push back against not just Black joblessness and Black pain and the drug epidemic, but the conservatives who really want to just abandon Black people to die in the ghetto. I'm about 4 chapters in of 7 chapters, and so we'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right. Much continued success, brother. And again, how can people contact you and follow you on social media?
Well, they can contact me right through the UMBC website. So if you go to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County History Department, you can find me there. My email's on there. You can, of course, check me out on Facebook and Instagram at GD Musgrove. And then please do check out the website, blackpowerindc.umbc.edu. Any of those places will eventually get you to an email from me, and just give me a shout. Let me know if there's any good papers out there about from the Black Power resurgence or the movement resurgence to the 80s and 90s, or if you need one of my articles or books. Okay, sounds good. Again, I really appreciate you, brother, and looking forward to speaking with you again real soon. Thanks much. It's good to see you, Malik. Take care, brother. You too. All right, brother. Take care. All right. You too. All right. Well, again, this is the Vanguard Show on Black Power Media. I want to thank my guests, G. Derek Musgrove and Musgrove, rather, and we're looking forward to the next segment in about 2 weeks. All power to the people.